So I had a client who said to her husband, "Tell me something you like about me." And he thought for a moment and he went, "Well, you're cute." And she immediately got frustrated. "That's not what I mean. You know what I mean." Now, what he said was the trigger. That's what activated in the moment. But in that next half a second is where everything really happens. Now, I call that the microscopic moment. And it's that tiny, tiny space between the trigger and what you do next. And for most of us, that tiny moment goes by so fast that most of us miss it. Most of the time, this trigger, we have it and we react to it before we even realize that it happens. It's like something hits the wrong way and then suddenly your nervous system kicks in. And that's before you really realize what's happening. This pattern starts and starts running the show. Now, you might snap, defend yourself, shut down, or you might try to explain why you think that the other person is wrong. And that happens so fast that most of us think that the reaction is the moment, but it isn't. There's actually this teeny tiny little space in between. The tiny space is where the pause lives. That's the microscopic moment. And again, most people don't notice it. The trigger hits and the reaction starts what feels like right away. But when you can pause in that moment, something different becomes possible. I mean, you can just notice what just happened. You can notice the story that your mind starts telling. You can notice what you're actually feeling. That pause gives you access to something that most people lose in the moment: choice. Now, most of us are trained to want the other person to change so that we don't have to experience what we're feeling. That's probably not going to happen though. But like from our example, if he had just said the right thing, she wouldn't have gotten frustrated. But let's flip this around. Imagine somebody comes to you and says, "You said the wrong thing earlier. You upset me. You need to say it differently." And then they expect you to just magically know what it is, this other part that they want you to speak. Now, how likely is it that you're going to be able to respond perfectly when you don't even know what it is that they're looking for, right? So most of us wouldn't, right? Most of us are like, I don't know what you want. It's like, it's not because there's something wrong with this, but how are we supposed to know what another person wants? All right, so the real moment. The real moment isn't the comment that the person made. The real moment is what happens inside of you right after you hear it. That's where that trigger lands. That's where the reaction starts to build. That's where that microscopic moment lives. Because right there in that teeny tiny space between you hearing it and then your body reacting, something very quickly happens inside of you. That story starts to form. Feelings start to rise. And then if there's no pause, that old reaction takes over before you even notice it. So here's the interesting point. Most people I work with already know this about themselves. They know their triggers, they're familiar with their patterns, their thoughts. They've read the books and done reflection. They already have that awareness. They have a certain amount of confidence, courage, all to a degree. But the moment that trigger actually hits, it's like they can't seem to stop it. They can't access what they wish they would be doing. And it's not because they lacked insight, because that trigger moves faster than their awareness. That's why the pause matters so much. Because the pause slows the moment down enough for you to access what you already know. So what makes the pause possible? When the pause is there, everything changes. It's not because the other person changed. You're still going to get triggered, but because you can stay with yourself long enough to choose something different, you can notice what you're feeling, you can see the story your mind's starting to tell, And instead of the old reaction taken over, you have a moment to decide what you'd rather do next. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It just means you're doing it more consciously. And that small shift right there in the microscopic moment is where new patterns have the opportunity to begin. So imagine that moment again. He says, well, you're cute, and that trigger hits, but this time, instead of reacting immediately, there's a pause. And in that pause, she might notice, what story am I telling myself right now? What do I really need in this moment? And from there, she could respond differently. Now, this doesn't only happen in relationships. It happens in business, leadership, coaching, everywhere. For example, a coach might feel frustrated when a client isn't following through. The trigger hits, and without a pause, that frustration can quickly turn into irritation or pressure. Like inside, the thought starts forming that the client is the problem. They need to do something and change. But with a pause, something else becomes possible. There's curiosity, openness, clarity. Clarity about yourself, clarity about the situation, clarity about the other person. And that creates a very different kind of conversation, starting in your mind, but then outwardly. That tiny pause can completely change how an interaction unfolds. Like a long time ago, I had a client who was very inconsistent. She would miss appointments, and there would always be like apologies and explanations. And I remember just kind of getting really upset with her. Like, I had done the work to prepare for our session. I showed up, I was ready for her, and I wanted her to succeed. She wasn't doing the things that needed for that to happen. So after the third time of it happening, I knew that I needed to do something different because I was feeling disrespected, and I didn't feel like she was respecting me or my time. Right? Now, if I'd have had a reaction from that feeling, I would have probably lashed out. But that pause helped me see something different. That feeling of disrespect was happening inside of me, but it wasn't necessarily about her being wrong or bad. It was a reaction that I was having. I was reacting emotionally, so I chose, let me write her a letter. And in the letter, I was able to explain my expectations and my boundaries around missed sessions. Same situation, different responses. And that difference happened because of the pause. Now, the pause is almost invisible, but it changes everything. Because when the pause is present, you can finally access what you actually already know. And when that happens, you stop reacting automatically and you start responding intentionally. And that tiny shift can completely change the direction of a conversation. You know, most people think that the problem is the trigger, and if only the other person would have done things differently. But the real turning point in life is learning to stay with yourself the moment the trigger hits, that microscopic moment where everything can change. Maybe over the next few days, pay attention to the moments when something small triggers you. Someone says something, an email lands wrong, a client doesn't follow through, maybe that partner doesn't do what they should do. And the instant that reaction wants to take over, pause. In the next couple of days, I'm going to be sending a practice to help you start noticing and recognizing that moment in real time. So if you're not on my email list but you'd like to receive it, you can subscribe below. The link is in the description box. So start noticing the microscopic moment, because that is where the new choices begin.